Hello everyone, welcome back to Alfie Bunga Bunga. This is Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It's Tuesday the 21st of September. George Hoare is away, but I'm joined by Philip Cunliffe as usual. Hello Philip.
Hey Alexander, how's it going?
Good, we should use our surnames as well.
We can stick to professional titles, Mr. Hochuli. I'm doing very well. How are you?
Yes, no, very well, thank you.
Thank you what?
Phil. And we are joined, once again by Dominik Leusder. Dominik is a researcher at the LSE in London and at Designaat Zukunft, the Institute for Macrofinance in Berlin. Hello, Dominik, Mr. Leusder.
How's it going, Mr. Hochuli and Dr. Cunliffe?
Yeah, there we go. Germans respect professional titles.
Yes, especially when they're authentic and weren't attained by plagiarism.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I was surprised to learn actually about how many German politicians have plagiarized their academic CVs, because I thought that was a Brazilian specialty, and it's good to know that Germany does it too. And I'm sure actually lots of Brazilians will be pleased to hear that the Germans that they look up to also do it. Which actually a bit of foreshadowing about what we're going to be talking about. Because we are talking about Germany's elections, which are coming up this weekend, and which should be a pretty epochal election, and the emphasis on should, because it's obviously the first election which will not result in Merkel as the chancellor since 2005. And it's also the first time there's no incumbent chancellor leading her party for re-election. And, we've obviously been coming off the back of what some people have called the populist decade. And Germany still seems relatively unchallenged by any populist upsurges. Just a little bit of other notes for context. It's also the first major and truly post-COVID election. I think the US election last year was still really in the midst of the pandemic. Canada had an election yesterday, but that was a bit of a damn squib, which just returned the status quo ante. And Germany obviously is far more important than Canada. Sorry, Canadian listeners. But we have a lot more, I think, German listeners. So, I'm just playing to the crowd here. But anyway, so, the questions you could ask about this election, it would seem, would be, well, is this going to be a continuation or an acceleration of the populist decade? Will it lead to some sort of technocratic restoration? Will it lead to something else? But instead, it seems like continuity is on the cards. So, Dominik, you're German. Why is Germany so boring?
Yeah, no, it's hard. Now it looks like that, the world is sort of once again waiting for a revolution in Germany, and Bidenism is just a rearguard action. But if you look at the last 15, 16 years, you didn't expect this, of course, because as you say, they were extraordinarily boring for Germans, at least, and for those who follow German politics. The consequences of German politics for the rest of Europe and for the world in some regard weren't that boring, unfortunately. I think part of the answer to your question is how has Germany bucked some of the big political trends that we've seen in other countries? One of them is surely party political fragmentation, or Dutchification, as some people call it, and widespread polarization at the same time societally in the public discourse and around certain topics. And it seems as though they've bucked the trend, but what you might conclude is that they have quite a few different problems and that they've just found ways to postpone the consequences of those problems.
Yeah.
Until now.
So, looking at the election, which is obviously coming up in a couple of days, I was just having a look at the polls, the kind of long-term poll trackers, and there's a remarkable sort of U-shape during the pandemic, literally from kind of early 2020, I assume from around March 2020 to around March 2021, where the CDU, the main center-right party, along with its coalition partners, the CSU, has seen a huge bump. Massively leading the field, while the Greens and the neoliberal AfD way down. And I guess these can be seen in some ways as, well, sort of protest parties of the left and the right. But now the CDU has fallen back down again. And actually the SPD, the Social Democrats, are leading the polls and looking to form a government. So, well, I guess, first of all, how has this come about? What's behind this SPD surge?
I think you have to explain both the sudden surge in the SPD's vote share, and why it had been so low before, and why there hadn't been that much fluctuation in normal times. As you point out, there's this strange bump for the CDU during the COVID crisis, which you simply attribute to rallying around the flag. And German political sentiments are strongly influenced by a need for stability. No one embodies that as much as Merkel and sort of the main line of Christian democratic CDU politics. So that you might just explain away as an aberration, but why had the vote shares not changed that much over the last decade, and why suddenly this huge change? And I think part of it is what I already tried to allude to, and that there's a great deal of convergence around certain issues in the center in Germany. So that's, for one, explained perhaps why social democracy was in a bit of a rut until recently, because the SPD had lost quite a few of its traditional voters when they moved to the center. And the kind of center-based consensus politics does breed a certain disinterest in politics, and so people don't really care too much about voting, and they don't think about the decisions too much. But then once there is an election, it's sort of a race to be the least popular or the least unpopular party, because you're not really campaigning on issues that much as much as you're campaigning on who can project this image of stability more than anyone else, and who needs to be punished, so to say. And in this case, because the CDU had blundered a bit towards the end of the crisis, namely by enacting some lockdown measures which were very seen as rather over the top, being embroiled in a scandal regarding the procurement of masks, and so on and so forth. And of course, the election of their candidate, Armin Laschet, who is the president of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the most populous state in Germany, and who was seen as a bit of a dud, and who committed a series of gaffes, including he was seen laughing in the background while attending a press conference for the flood victims in North Rhine-Westphalia, his state. There was an emergency press conference, and he was seen laughing at the back, and that didn't sit well with quite a few voters. And I think there was a collective feeling that the CDU had to be punished as well.
I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, just reading the reporting on kind of the lead up to the election, that the reasons given for why the CDU has kind of fallen in the polls, and also the Greens, is because of these little gaffes. And it seems, it kind of remarkably minor sorts of little things which has caused fluctuations in the polls. It does seem to be really so based just around projection of image, and particularly an image of competence, which is something that feels very sort of 90s and 2000s, I suppose.
And I wanted to add to that, I guess, Dominik, which is Alex's question first, I suppose, is the question of, is it just about image? And if so, then is Olaf Scholz, who's leading the SPD, and the bookies say is the most likely candidate to replace Merkel, is his image based on trying to be as close to Merkel as possible then? Is that why he's likely to win?
It's surely both. I mean, surely he's trying to triangulate in a way. He's trying to both project himself as a continuation of Merkelism, and he's actually very explicitly done so by emulating that strange gesture that Merkel makes with her hands.
We're going to come on to this. We're going to come on to this.
the Merkel triangle, so to say. And he's done that on election board. For some reason, election billboards in Germany are just huge faces of the candidates rather than slogans or images. It's a bit creepy, but one of them featured Olaf Scholz doing the Merkel gesture. On the other hand, he is also very explicitly speaking about nominally left-wing policies, or traditionally social democratic sort of mainstream policies, such as a 12 euro minimum wage, higher investments, investment into climate, decarbonization, and all those things. And both those things seem to be working, and it's a question which is the bait and switch in the end. So because at some point, Merkelism 2.0 is incompatible with fiscal reforms and getting serious on climate change. However, if you do look at the polls, there are polls that the questions are: would you have voted for the SPD if the candidate of the CDU, so of the Christian Democrats, had been someone else? In this case, the ministerial president of Bavaria, his name is Söder. Had it been Söder, for instance, Scholz would not be currently leading the race. So it's quite an open question.
And it seems kind of relatively personalized for the sort of the system that Germany has, right? But personalized at the same time as the personalities themselves are fairly grey, right? I mean, I guess I don't know if you can characterize, some of the other kind of party leaders, maybe of the Greens, for starters. I mean, what sort of politicians are these, or is it easy enough just to say, listen, they're kind of sort of grey non-entities?
Can I just interrupt though before that? So picking up on this point about the posters, the billboards with the enormous faces. So it is very much then an election driven by image and personality rather than there's no meaningful policy disputes. Is that right?
So what has to be understood is that on the center right in Germany, so the conservative core of Christian democratic voters doesn't seem to care that much about politics, because progressive politics is difficult in Germany, and I think that at least in part explains the convergence around the center, which in turn explains why the elections and the fluctuations in polling are driven by these minor issues, because there's nothing meaty to actually contest. If you ask, for instance, now this is anecdata, but if you go to northern Bavaria, which is profoundly conservative, they are having problems voting for Armin Laschet, the current candidate of the CDU, because they think he's a dud and they think he's uncharismatic, and certainly not Merkel. Merkel isn't charismatic, but she has this gravitas, and she's by any standards a very competent politician, and she projects power. So people want a powerful man or woman who can guarantee stability and who can guarantee that nothing much changes. So I think on the center right, issues don't really matter that much, but they seem to matter more on the center left. Hence what might be lip service to minimum wage and investment, what might be meaningful policy ambitions, we don't know yet. As for Alex's question about who are these people? So Armin Laschet is, as I said, he's sort of he's not. He's not terribly uncharismatic, I would say, but he's not. He's sort of a typical Rhinelander, I think people would say. So he's a bit laconic, sort of a bit. Certainly can be witty, and can crack a joke. But as we saw, that tendency is perhaps cost him the election, because he was apparently cracking jokes in the background while people were mourning the dead. Olaf Scholz is originally from Lower Saxony, but he grew up in Hamburg, and he's stereotypically a Hamburgian in the sense that he's quite dry, very conservative in a way. He doesn't really say much. He's a bit phlegmatic, if you want. And he's the conservative, bourgeois conservative wing of the Social Democrats, who used to be radical in his youth, of course, but now has sort of matured. And he was the mayor of Hamburg, which is it's the richest city in Germany, but it's a merchant city. So he's very much the face of the SPD that you can sell to the German mainstream.
I read him described today as if he looked as if he was lost leaving an accountants convention.
That's good.
Which sounds pretty damning, at least in terms of projecting.
Yeah, but I feel like that's quite a lot of Germans, unfortunately.
I wasn't going to say it.
No, that's true. He's not quite in terms of on the spectrum of uncharismatic. He isn't quite Hermann von Rompuy. I don't know whether you remember him. Terribly, Farage famously said that he had the charisma of a wet rag. But he's not very charismatic either. It's true, and I would say the same of Anna Baerbock, who's the leader of the Greens. She of course, the Greens they're quite a bourgeois party, if you like, and they've been in coalitions on the state level with the CDU, but they're a bit more young. I think the average age of politicians is quite a bit lower, and she, I think, she can come across as a bit more animated and confident and interesting, and she's done so. She's come across that way in the recent televised debates between the three candidates. But none of them, I think that while the campaign is driven by personalities, it's not the most charismatic personality that wins. It might actually be the most boring personality, because that's anything that isn't boring might be suspicious to voters in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, that is quite interesting, despite evidently being not that enthusing, if you're following the election. But we should maybe turn a little bit, and I guess we can round off talking a little bit more about talking about what's likely to happen a little bit later on. But we should look backwards now, I guess, at Merkel, because Merkel has this astonishing longevity, outlived so many other personalities and on the political stage, both Europe wide and beyond that as well. What, I guess, just for starters, I guess, what has made her such a resilient figure? I mean, people always described her as sort of Teflon Merkel and so on. Where does she draw her power from? Does she have a particular power base? I mean, I understand that she kind of made her CDU into a fairly big tent party. So, I mean, I don't know. Can you sum up what explains her longevity?
I mean, first, for context, German politicians' chances tend to have very long terms. So there's no term limits, so no constitutionally prescribed term limit, nor is there some sort of gentleman's agreement on just running, 10 years or something like that. And many former chancellors have been in office for quite a while, including Merkel's mentor, in a way, Helmut Kohl, who was in office for, I think, 15 or 16 years as well. And she was, I believe, the Minister for Women and Youth in the early 90s for Helmut Kohl, and then the Minister for the Environment, before she became, I think, one of the state-level party leaders. I mean, so that puts a different complexion in it, but even for that, for German politics, she has proven herself quite resilient. I think the first question, the first answer to that question is, she's just a very competent politician, first of all. I mean, one has to grant her that, even if you're coming from a left perspective, the same way you have to grant Margaret Thatcher for being a very competent politician. In other words, she knows how to react to situations. She knows how to maneuver herself through crises, and not just in the way that people tend to talk about her, not just in the Teflon way. So she reacts to accusations and scandals by simply giving some sort of equivocating answer and changing the topic. And she does it so convincingly that nothing can actually stick to her, as he said. But she's quite adept at doing things behind the scenes as well. So just to give you an example, during the European debt crisis, and I think we'll get back to this topic eventually, because it's emblematic of her entire legacy. She gave Wolfgang Schäuble, who was then the finance minister of Germany, a mandate to engage in negotiations with the Greek government, then led by Syriza, the far left government. And she said, you negotiate with your counterparty, Yanis Varoufakis, and I'll be on the sidelines. But if that didn't work out too well, of course. There were Varoufakis was not someone to give in, apparently, and he had a strong bond with the Greek prime minister. And what she then decided to do is to sort of go behind their backs and invite the Greek prime minister to dinner at some, she booked an entire restaurant in Frankfurt and just sat down there with, Tsipras and a few other people, just to make him feel part of the process. She basically seduced him in a way. She promised him, a purchase on what would happen in the debt agreement, the memorandum, which was eventually signed. She lulled him into a false sense of security, so that she could isolate him from Varoufakis, which in the end is what proved decisive, because after the referendum in Greece, Tsipras said, we're not going to go with it. And he did sign under the dotted line. And that was Merkel in the background. So she can be quite adept at sort of, public being in the public eye, being very unassuming and sort of, conservative, steering away from scandals, but behind the scenes, she's quite adept. I think that's.
But I think what's interesting
part of it
there is that, as you say, kind of can be quite adept and devious, even working behind the scenes. But you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, also as a competent politician. But Thatcher was a very radical figure who took on her enemies head on, and Merkel seems to be an altogether different sort of character, more maneuvering, shifting from one side to the other. No especially strong ideological convictions by the looks of it, more just sort of managing and sidestepping and rearranging things so that nothing really particularly changes, mainly holding things in place. And so, in that regard, I'm wondering whether there's a better comparison to her than Margaret Thatcher, for example. I don't know if there's anyone who strikes you as being a comparable figure to Merkel in terms of.
I could say someone like Shinzo Abe, perhaps. People do make a comparison, strike a comparison between German and Japanese politics, as it has the same emphasis on stability. It doesn't actually end up as very stable, in the sense that you have many different governments and many different prime ministers, but the electoral preference for stability and someone who can project it, and for someone who is essentially post-ideological, is there. And you're right in saying that Margaret Thatcher was deeply ideologically motivated and in a way prepared to make it rain on everyone, even some of the Tory party's old constituencies. Whereas Merkel is sort of the opposite. Your friend of the show, Wolfgang Streeck, once described Merkel as the perfect postmodern politician, because she doesn't actually stand for very much, and her most radical actions are those that change everything to keep everything the same.
Yeah.
To the extent that you can sum up her legacy over the last 10 years, it's only enacting change if it's necessary to keep everything the same. So you have that leopard principle that you talked about with Adam Tooze in your recent episode, that at some point the establishment has to enact change just to maintain their grip on power. And I think that it also makes her so suitable to German politics, because the way the system is built up, the federal system, it makes political action very costly. And a politician that can still maintain power in that system is Merkel, because she is so cautious to begin with, and she doesn't require, bold pivoting and big issues to actually stay in power.
One thing which is, I suppose, slightly more not tangential, but I wonder how important it is to understanding her political persona, is the fact that she's a woman, obviously, and also the persona that was kind of created by some of her supporters in a very knowing, and again, I suppose, postmodern and ironic way, was the idea of her as Mutti, or the diminutive for mother in German. So how important is that, do you think, that kind of protective embrace, the caring maternal figure who keeps kind of the domestic household, runs domestic household affairs very competently, might do some things in the background, is in charge of the finances, but you can rely on her, and she's not glamorous, she's not charismatic, like you say, but she's serious and dependable. Is that, it seems to me it must be very important, but I don't know if perhaps that's just being perhaps overly psychologistic in trying to understand her enduring kind of strength over the last 15 years.
I think there's sorry.
Well, no, and just to tack something on there. I think also very much as a mother figure and not as a father. She's not the one laying down the law, right? Establishing rules. It's far more kind of flexible, working in the background. Well, in the way that Phil described very well. And also, you mentioned earlier the Merkel the rhombus that she does with her fingers. And if you've ever seen, I think the cover image for this episode will have a picture of that, so listeners, you can check that out. But kind of, it's a way that kind of politicians who are obviously coached and have media trained and so on, just learn to be like, okay, I'm going to keep my hands like this so that when I appear on camera, I'm not going to be waving my arms around or looking awkward, not knowing what to do with my arms. But someone suggested this to me the other day, and it does seem to be right, that it's a womb. The thing that she's doing is the shape of a womb right in front of where her womb would be. So it's just recapitulating that sort of maternal imagery.
For my style, that would be too psychologistic, to be honest. But it's a funny take, and it's kind of bizarre because it does seem like something that's perfectly sort of stage managed. Like she has some motivational coach at some point, or public speaking coach who told her, do something with your hands because it looks awkward if you don't know what to do with them. But that's not unique to her. I mean, even someone like Barack Obama, who's obviously sort of a born public speaker, he used to have that gesture with his fists. I don't know whether you remember. He would just punctuate whatever he said with clenched fists, with his thumb sticking out slightly. So that's sort of a thing that every politician nowadays has, a sort of a gimmick. And I wouldn't rate the importance of that rhombus too highly, but it is true that this Mutti image, so that the caring image, does seem to play a big role. And I think you could attribute it, at least in part, to some somewhat repressed form of nationalism and a repressed sort of fear of the outside world in a way. It's a very insular society, and this came through in some of the recent debates, that there were barely any discussions of geopolitics and foreign policy and Europe even. I mean, you would expect at least Europe to be on their agenda. Foreign policy, not so much. Not many countries actually, talk about foreign policy in their elections, save for the United States, perhaps, for obvious reasons. But I would say that part of the reason why she was able to project that stature as a protective and caring figure is because Germany became so powerful in her during her tenure, which in turn has nothing to do with what she did. I mean, if anything, she weakened Germany. So the simple fact that by virtue of having the euro, by virtue of the reforms that were enacted in the years preceding her reign by her rival Gerhard Schröder, in fact, and including some of the people who are now on the left, like Wolfgang Streeck as well, those reforms really set the scene for Germany to become an economic superpower and to have more geopolitical clout to throw around. And that, in turn, made Germans think that Germany was rising again, or was safe and more powerful. There was a constant polling. Do you think that Merkel has made Germany more powerful, more safe? And people overwhelmingly vote yes, and people overwhelmingly say that's important to them as well. But now, what you see, if you ask the center right, roughly speaking, and the center left, how do you see the trend in Germany? The center right will say, if I'm not mistaken, they will see Germany as declining, and the center left will see the opposites. So that consensus has somehow changed. During Merkel's tenure, people tended to think that Germany was doing better and that they were becoming more prosperous as a country and being more safe. And I think the crisis has broken that consensus. And I think Merkel may or may not be able to even, she wouldn't perhaps be successful in the coming 10 years if she could stay on.
So German kind of power in this particular moment, and for reasons that I guess are historically obvious, it has to be expressed. I suppose at the European level, it has to be kind of packaged in a European, cosmopolitan, supranational way rather than German self-assertion. And I guess what you're suggesting also is that it also has to be packaged in a feminine way, and that too is part of its effect, I suppose. Is that right?
That I don't know. I mean, I'm far from an expert in those things. I could imagine that the fact that one associates, conservatively speaking, one associates caring with mothers and mother figures, and discipline and harshness with father figures. And Germans do tend to care about sound money politics and keeping debt in check. And they had a very severe father during most of Merkel's reign, that was the finance minister. So that she was I think are quite deliberately kept. I mentioned it before that she gave Wolfgang Schäuble a mandate to negotiate the debt crisis so that she would be unaffected from the blowout. Unlike Schäuble, who is no longer finance minister and who was eventually reined back by her due to his acting in the crisis. So I think that she was able to separate herself from those more unpopular, perhaps, but also necessary sort of, if you want to call it fatherly, demanding disciplinary actions.
Yeah. It's fascinating, I suppose, to me at least, is I can't think of any other female politician of her longevity and stature in recent times. The only kind of, comparable person would be Benazir Bhutto. And, obviously she was assassinated some years back. And so it's fascinating to me what are the kind of roles that are available to female politicians in the contemporary Western context, at least. And she seems to have found one, that suits not only her constituency, her voters, but also seems to have worked effectively for Germany abroad as well. And there's so many, I would say, even when critical, nonetheless respectful accounts of her from abroad in the international press. I think that's telling to some degree of nobody seems to be able to quite pin down what is the basis of her political appeal.
It took a Berlusconi to say something bad about her. Words I probably shouldn't repeat. But
well, now that you've started, Alex, you can hardly stop, can you?
And I have to say, I'm not endorsing these words, but he called her an unfuckable fat ass some years back, which I don't think he said this directly to the press, but it was overheard anyway. But anyway, I guess that proves Phil's point. It's
I should say though, just to add some nuance to that story, she only very recently, in the last weeks, came out as a feminist. She never used that term to herself. And I think when she was elected, I seem to remember this, that it was certainly noted that she was the country's first female leader, but it was never that much of an issue throughout her entire reign. I mean, I'm sure some, enterprising journalist or academic wrote some hagiography about her and had a few chapters on how she, represents something about female politics. But she's a very competent politician, and that's how she was seen. She was never really seen as, a standard bearer for female politicians around the world. It was never really that much of an issue because those kind of identity politics are still, I think, a big turnoff for most German, especially conservative German voters. I'm quite surprised that she actually came out now as a feminist, but partly because she's no longer running for office.
No, indeed. And I guess that reinforces the point about her maternal kind of appeal. She doesn't need to be an she doesn't need to wave the flag for feminism because it's all the understated maternal image. But in any case,
she's succeeded where other women have failed in Germany. I mean, the current Commission president is Ursula von der Leyen.
Yes,
who's,
of course, yes.
Also a very successful politician in Germany. In that, she was very high level, but she catastrophically failed as defense minister, and she was pushed to Brussels, as most politicians are, who fail at home. And she didn't manage that. Neither did her original successor, the
AKK.
AKK. She also had the same problem. So it's not just about her being a woman; it's just about her persona in general, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think actually that's really interesting, her success compared to other German female politicians whose stars seem to be rising and then were cut short. But I guess, we can move on to thinking about some of the most significant aspects of her term in office. And the line in the FT is, the Financial Times was from the sick man of Europe to the second Wirtschaftswunder, referring to the post-war German economic miracle and Germany recovered from the war. So how far is that? You've mentioned already that she benefited, I suppose, from the economic reforms that were made under her predecessor, Gerhard Schröder. But how significant is that economic transformation of Germany during her term in office?
The the transformation itself is quite significant in that Germany was doing quite poorly after reunification. It was doing quite poorly even after the dot-com crisis, which people forget actually did lead to a small recession in Germany. And it was around the time of where that new phase of globalization was really kicking off. And as an export economy, it's highly sensitive to, global competitive disinflation. So remaining competitive also on a cost competitiveness level. In other words, the German elites felt like they had to do some harsh reforms, including labor market reforms, to remain competitive, to avoid long-term structural permanent unemployment. And I actually, somewhat unusually for sort of a lefty economist, think that the German model is actually quite successful in that sense that it managed to overcome this distribution, this coordination failure in the distribution of adjustment pain. In other words, it could have led to high unemployment, but what we got instead was a labor market that was dualized. In other words, you have this whole massive, this new part of the labor market which is cut out of the permanent contracts and unionized jobs, has these flexible contracts, et cetera, which is lower paid and which has accepted sort of a permanent wage cut or a lid on wages in general. That, if you credit that with the recovery in the first decade of the century, then it has nothing to do with Merkel, of course, because those things were done before her time.
Yeah, the hard sphere reform, labor market reforms, as they're called.
Yeah, exactly. The way I looked at Merkel is not. It's very misleading to look at Germany's performance in that time. You have to look at what was the potential growth and on which path dependencies did her policy create for Germany, and I think then it's an overwhelmingly negative term, because the most consequential aspect of her policy, of her term in office, is that she oversaw the lowest level of net public investment in post-war German history. Essentially, net public investment stagnated. It was more or less at zero. So the net investment into fixed capital, that includes infrastructure, includes digital infrastructure, schools, and all those things, utilities. During a period in which Germany was very fiscally sound, had a lot of fiscal space, a lot of capacity to spend, and in which interest rates on German bonds was incredibly low, and now, in fact, large parts of the yield curve is negative. In other words, they get paid for holding investors' money, and even if interest rates weren't negative, they would probably make up the spending from debt financing would actually make up for itself, because it would cause sufficient growth to, cancel out the higher debt burden. And this is an extraordinary waste of potential, of course, and it has all sorts of consequences distributionally within Germany, but of course for Europe and for the world as a whole. I mean, recall the extraordinary. I mean, we don't tend to think about this in the context of the 2008 crisis, but only China at that point was guaranteeing some global demand to prop up the global economy, which had fallen off a cliff. Obama stimulus was famously too small as a result of congressional politics, and there was no stimulus in what was then still the largest trading bloc in the world, the largest economic bloc, the Eurozone, and it is largely on account of, in fiscal policy terms, on the consensus that's led by Germany that we shouldn't spend. And that really...
So we will talk about. I want to talk a bit more about that, but just before that, I suppose I wondered if you could talk a bit about the experience of ordinary Germans in this period. So you've mentioned the dualization of the labour market, and wage stagnation. Average wages are stagnant, and there's been kind of sluggish productivity growth. So employment has remained high. And you mentioned the lack of public investment, and Wolfgang Streeck on a previous episode has mentioned the fact of kind of the decay of Germany's public infrastructure, which is quite striking in the context of in Germany's economic reputation. So I suppose what does ordinary life feel like for Germans in this period? So they feel kind of secure, but hard done by, or were they content despite the fact that wages were stagnant, but everyone felt they had a job and there was, and they felt more or less secure under Merkel's stewardship?
Well, and just to tack something on there as well, because I mean, despite high labour force participation, lots of women in the workforce, a lot of it's, from my understanding, part-time and precarious. So I mean, and then as you've said, this kind of dualised labour market. So just another element to tack on to Phil's question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's important to put it in perspective, and yes, you did these reforms did create a second labour market in which people had non-unionized jobs mainly, were sort of were more precarious, as you say. So they're so-called 0-hour contracts in which you might not make any income. You have no guaranteed income. You had, as a crisis response, a lot of sort of semi-furloughing. I'm not sure how it would be called in English, but we call it Kurzarbeit. In other words, people would just accept a cut in the hours worked, and that's sort of the bargain that you're not laid off, but you accept just a huge cut in your wages, but you don't have to work either. And that's, I think, as I said, not a bad thing overall, because how other countries handle it is just simply to lay off more people to allow for that to happen. But there has been a huge lid on wages regardless. I mean, in recent years, in the last few years, there have been some successful demands for higher wages by the large unions, but overall there has been quite a firm lid. And I think German business has been quite clear about why, essentially, for the German manufacturing worker, the third world begins 100 kilometers east of Berlin, in other words. So because they were able to extend their manufacturing supply line into Eastern Europe, they have far more leverage in negotiations, and they depend on that cheap pool of labor, but they also use it to keep quite a heavy lid on wages, as I said. And as a result, you see the household share of income, so the share of income by the household sector of total national income decreasing quite a bit, which means that profits are quite severely up, which in turn means that the savings rate is much higher because these people don't spend their money.
So just to be clear, so the basis then of your criticism of Merkel's tenure then is not so much the dualization of the labour market per se, but rather the fact that they haven't actually spent any of they haven't invested publicly in the way that they could have, given the state of German finances and interest rates and so on, as you said, and also the fact that wages have been kept so low. Is that right?
Yes, and what that means essentially is that there's no public investment and no private investment.
Yes,
because the savings are so high, and they go into saving assets and positional goods like housing, and that in turn increases wealth inequality quite severely. So one of the stylized facts about Germany that it has incredibly high levels of wealth inequality, comparable even to the United States, which you don't expect from a European country, which are generally
all right.
Our mutual friend Anton Jäger likes to say that the European wing of the Grand Hotel Abyss is slightly better run than the US one, and you expect lower inequality, but in Germany, wealth inequality is indeed very high, although you could still chalk that up to people not really owning their own house. But income inequality is also actually very high if you look at the pre-tax levels. In other words, a lot of incomes have actually stagnated while the upper tier incomes has increased. However, at the moment, it seems as though the welfare state is still doing its job in reshuffling that, but it's still quite striking that pre-tax sort of market income is incredibly unequal, again, quite comparable to that of the United States. So while it may have not felt as bad to live in Germany under Merkel as it might have felt under, let's say, Obama or any other comparable Western European country, or maybe Canada or the United States, because they were basically at full employment, right? And there is still quite a generous welfare state, but the trend, I think, was seen by large parts of the working class and the lower middle class as at least stagnant, at worst declining.
So this takes us on to the question of Germany's role in, which we've touched upon already, Germany's role in the Eurozone debt crisis, and how it links to Merkel's failure of leadership. So from my point of view, and this is a conversation I've had with people in Britain, was on the base and part of the basis of my support for Brexit was the lack of any possibility for supranational integration in the European Union. That the failure to kind of construct any kind of further political union and fiscal union to complement the Eurozone was part of the reason that I swung decisively in favour of Brexit, because, you know, I felt the moment for it, if there was ever a moment for it, it was in the wake of the debt crisis, beginning in 2008 and going on into 2015 and 16. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about Merkel's political failure, and perhaps if it is indeed her greatest political failure and perhaps her most important lasting legacy was her failure to meaningfully reform or make an effort to reform the Eurozone. My view was always, if a blueprint had been on the table, I would have been willing to discuss it, but nothing was ever offered.
I think that's there's a paradox in European politics, which is that it requires a great deal of coordination and solidarity to integrate further, because it always involves some degree of risk sharing and some degree of even distribution at some point, opening up your labor markets to competition, etc., and accepting freedom of movement. But paradoxically, when that coordination and that solidarity is needed most, namely during crises, it is the hardest to come by, because these crises tend to throw up previously perhaps dormant imbalances between countries, and that changes the bargaining position of some countries vis-a-vis others, right? And this was definitely the case in the Euro crisis, where you had the net creditor countries, so Germany and a couple of the northern countries, Netherlands, Austria, Slovakia, very, very firm on not granting any debt relief, not discussing haircuts or sovereign default for Greece in that case, and in fact making these countries sign memoranda that in the Greek case lent them a whole bunch of money under conditions that made that money impossible to repay. So the reform packages that were enacted as a result of that kind of politics did cause an unbelievable amount of damage. And in some cases, as the Greek case, it's hard to see how living standards can really recover in the coming decades from that kind of shock. But you might treat Greece as a sort of an outlier. And you shouldn't, and this is my sort of my slight pushback, you shouldn't quite absolve the individual governments of those countries that suffered most, Spain being one of them, but also Italy, from responsibility. I mean, they were quite enthusiastic as well, at least when the centre-right party in Spain was in power. There's a common cause between the German corporate sector and German conservative elites and their counterparts in other countries. And I also tend to push back against the idea of German hegemony. Curiously, perhaps, because I just talked about how they were the driving force behind the austerity politics of those years. But it should be said again, they're not alone, and they have been recalcitrant to the main arm of European economic policy making, namely monetary policy, from the very beginning. So they didn't gain presidency of the ECB via Weidmann, head of the Bundesbank. It was, of course, first Trichet and then Draghi, who then, in his capacity as president of the central bank, saved the Eurozone, if you want. And there have been multiple challenges, legal challenges by the German Constitutional Court, but also a lot of complaining and rumbling in German elites, and nothing has happened. I think that consensus is more firm than ever. And I think if that's the main policy-making arm economically, monetary policy, then you can't really speak of German hegemony in that sense. But as you say, it's not really only about missing out on a lot of growth in Germany and sort of condemning large sections of the lower middle class to stagnation and poverty because you don't want to invest even though you can. It's also about exporting deflation and the wrong kind of reforms to Europe and the world, because it's a net, asking everyone to cut back at the same time, to run trade surpluses at the same time in Europe. It doesn't cause import demand from the rest of the world. It causes the opposite in a way, and that is quite damaging.
But is that her I mean, can we say that's her greatest political failure? I mean, it was a genuine world historic crisis, which is to say there was the opportunity perhaps for actually perhaps mounting the beginning of reform to the European Union that could have taken it in a more genuinely integrated direction. I mean, kind of for the sake of argument's sake, and she failed it. And so is it something, I mean, not in just her. I mean, as you mentioned, the German elites, as well as elites in other countries, are part of it. But nonetheless, she must bear some of that political responsibility. It happened on her watch, right?
Yes and no. I think that economically speaking, it is her responsibility. That she was in the background, but she underwrote this kind of politics. So in as much as she has some sort of ideology, it's certainly boilerplate, austerian, sound money. But as I said, politically speaking, the crisis wasn't actually the point at which Europe could integrate further. Because my point is that this crisis theory of the Eurozone is fundamentally flawed. The sound reforms that lead to spillover, and that down the road lead to more integration are usually made during peace times. And I think that the aftermath of this crisis, because it isn't actually a European crisis and it isn't a debt crisis, because those are off the table now that we have activist monetary policy. Now there might actually be a window for reform. Fiscal reform at the European level, but that's exactly what's at stake in the German and the French election too, actually.
So tell us then about how you, just quickly, because we want to move on, but maybe just quickly tell us about what are the prospects or the possibilities for a change in Germany's economic relations, particularly within the Eurozone, within the European Union, with somebody new at the helm?
I think you've alluded to it already, that, and this seems to be a view shared on the left as well, and center-left circles, that it might be disappointing in the sense that even if the Social Democrats win, and we get a coalition that is amenable to these kind of reforms, nothing much might actually happen. And that might be the case, but it is worth emphasizing that the SPD, the Greens, and the Linke, so the far left party in Germany, do seem to more or less agree on major policy domains and how to reform them, roughly speaking. So they all nominally at least have committed to higher investments. The SPD wants a higher minimum wage of 12 euros. They want investment into decarbonization, and they want some extension of welfare and more taxation, to progressive taxation of some kind. And that, I think, it should matter. Again, as I said, it's not clear whom Scholz is bait and switching, because he's trying to play both sides, obviously. But he seems to have undergone a transformation sometime throughout his term, somewhat changing his mind on fiscal matters. This is the guy who famously said, a German finance minister is a German finance minister, after he ran on a more lefty campaign. And then once he was in office, he just turned around and said, you know what, I'm not different than Schäuble, because I'm just another German guy who doesn't want to spend.
Right.
But I should say that it matters so much what the eventual coalition is. To answer your question, Philip, because, and that is to some extent tea leaf reading, because regardless of the outcome of the elections, the immediate outcome, anything can go in the coalition negotiations. So you might end up with a coalition that doesn't even include the SPD potentially, right? And we can talk about that if you want to.
We might round off there, but before that, I thought we should talk a bit about climate change, because there's some talk in the media that this is or should be or was to be the climate change election. And just to look up I looked up some of the figures on this, some of the polling and whatever. 28% of Germans see climate change as the most important global issue, against 18% for the EU average. 2/3 of Germans believe the government isn't doing enough. 79%, which I thought was quite high, say they're personally taking action against climate change or have done it over the past 6 months. And then you had the devastating floods this summer where 181 people died, and it seemed like it was all set up to be this kind of big climate change elections with the Greens already kind of seeming to pull away a lot of the SPD's traditional support, or maybe not traditional support, but at any rate, part of the SPD's support. And now they, in fact, ended up stationed in the high teens. I don't know, how should we understand ecological politics in Germany in light of this election? I mean, to what extent has there been much debate around this? Is there any sort of sense of polarization over positions on climate change, or is it more or less everybody just saying, yeah, we need to take action a bit faster, a bit slower, whatever, but that's more or less the substance of the debate?
So first of all, I don't think that in some countries, notably the US, of course, there's always some fringe that in the mainstream of politics denies that climate change even exists, right? I don't think there's anyone in the German mainstream who denies climate change. And I think everyone thinks that, emissions have to be lowered quite significantly. And as you say, polls seem to indicate that people are aware that something must be done and they want their politicians to do more. For some reason, so I was under the impression that the floods in Western Germany, which of course is the constituency of Armin Laschet, because he's the minister president there in North Rhine-Westphalia, would put climate change at the forefront of the election, but it doesn't seem to have done so for some reason. And his decline in the rankings due to his own personality and his own gaffes. That's quite disheartening. I think it does seem to say that people might be aware of climate change and aware of the need to do something about it, but they're not quite. No one has fully internalized the gravity of the issue, that it has to be done now, and just how much has to be done. And curiously, the biggest skeptics of what they would call alarmism are in the FDP, so in the right-wing liberal party. And that's what people have noted. They've noted that in with regards to possible coalitions, that whatever their skepticism is, it might be incompatible with the Greens. And therefore it might it might constrain coalition finding after the elections. As for climate ambitions among the big two parties, if you look at what they've actually done in recent years, so Merkel and her party, the CDU, it's quite I think it's quite a grim assessment. They've more or less quite blatantly sided with big auto producers in Germany. There was this whole kerfuffle about the emissions problem. So not greenhouse gas emissions, but there was, first of all, there were emission scandals, of course, to which the German government didn't really take to task their own companies for cheating on emissions tests. But it was then ruled by the EU that you can't allow urban areas to experience a certain amount of carbon monoxide emissions because the pollution is actually quite deadly. And after a lot of back and forth, the reaction of the German government was simply to raise that standard. So they said, we're not going to accept the European standard, we're going to raise ours so that suddenly these urban areas are no longer technically in violation of that standard, which is, I think, the biggest, the most blatant sort of nod to the big auto producers that, you shouldn't worry about having to produce less polluting vehicles anytime soon. So there's no real ambition. So if we step aside and say, what actually has to be done to reduce the stock of atmospheric carbon as quickly as possible by the state, nothing is currently suggested in the mainstream of German politics that is nearly enough.
Well, and indeed, it seems to be going in the opposite direction, right? The winding down of nuclear power plants, the fact that renewables can't take up the slack, and therefore the dependence on gas especially, and even coal, seems to suggest that Germany is going in the wrong direction.
Yes, and I meant to mention the Greens, who are at least calling for very high investment into the climate transition, so into renewable energies, which I think we can take at face value. But on the other hand, it was really them who was most vocal in support of decommissioning nuclear power plants, as you say, because that was their initial, their original claim to be a party around one big issue was nuclear energy. Yeah, that's why they came into power, and that has sort of been done with, and unfortunately there's no sign that they'll ever actually put them back online, let alone build new ones. That will actually make it very hard to transition cleanly to
and
renewables.
it ties into the geopolitics of Merkel's time as Chancellor, because of the controversy over the Nord Stream gas pipeline, the Russians are constructing to get around Ukraine, which goes through the Baltic and the North Sea and around that region, and the closeness between Merkel and Putin, for which he's been criticized about breaking kind of solidarity within the Western camp and so on. Could you tell us a bit about that and how that has been seen in Germany among German commentators within the German elite?
Yeah, I think what that means is that
I mean, has she been criticised within Germany, or is the German elite behind the pro-Russian gas?
Broadly speaking, they're very much behind it. I think that there's some rumbling on the far left, but they're quite divided in Russia as well, I should say. There's quite a vocal sort of anti-NATO and sort of implicitly, I should say, I don't want to piss everyone off, but pro-Putin sort of, or soft on Putin part of the German far left. So there isn't that much criticism in the political elites, and I don't think that it's a big issue in public as well. And I think the priorities of a big trading power, a mercantilist power, if you want to call it that, they're not strictly geopolitical. And I think there's some sense in which they're trying to play both sides. They're trying to have their cake and eat it. They want to continue this, fairly important and lucrative deal, but they don't want to. At the same time, they want to signal that they're part of NATO and committed to NATO expansion and that they're America's allies. And I think there's a delusional belief that they can do that and that they can get away with it. And I think it's just one of those geopolitical issues that they're trying to ignore, and they're kicking the can down the road because resolving it would be quite difficult internally for them, because they do very much depend on this energy, because they're not capable of, or they've wasted time in sorting out their own domestic energy mix, so to say. So if they had invested much more into renewables, they would be far less concerned with this sort of stuff, and it wouldn't have the geopolitical ramifications that it does.
Right. Very good. I think we might have to leave that here. But that's been very interesting. I did want to finish off, though, Dominik, by asking you, I mean, for all that this is maybe somewhat of a continuity election, despite this very important figure, Merkel, leaving the scene, what your prognosis is. I'm just going to come out and say, what's your bet? What's going to happen? What's the emerging coalition, and what country's flag will will represent the colors of that coalition? If listeners don't know, that the talk is either of a Jamaica one or a Kenya one or a Germany flag anyway. So representing the colors of the parties. What is your shout?
Okay, so big disclaimer. This is obviously, as I said, tea leaf reading, because we don't know what will come out of the end. People, I think, are broadly speaking of a traffic light coalition. So the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. So that's the aforementioned right-wing liberal party. One reason to believe this is because the FDP has very violently signaled against it, strategically speaking, because they can't, if they actually, said they're prepared to do so under certain circumstances, they would lose votes to the CDU. And because they're openly against it, it might be that they're preparing for that eventuality. And they've also recently started to distance themselves from the debt brake. And but they may be preparing for that. Another reason is that some of the alternatives, so a Kenya coalition, for instance, led by the CDU, or Jamaica coalition, which is a CDU-led green FDP, so a black, green, yellow coalition, without the SPD, is also not in the books, because whatever happens, the CDU will lose quite big, and there'll be the impression they don't have the mandates to lead a government. So they might be quite content with going into the opposition. For a third reason too, and this is my third main point, because it's quite clear that Armin Laschet will probably resign, because he will be deemed a failure, and his rival is Markus Söder, the head of the CSU, which is the Bavarian wing of the CDU. And what they really care about is the Bavarian election, which is in 2 years. And so they might think, in order to win the Bavarian election, we have to be seen as a vocal opposition party hating on the SPD. And so he might, if he becomes the new president of the CDU, might not actually want to go into power. That, for me, speaks in favor of a traffic light coalition. But of course, there's no precedent for any of this, right? I mean, it's very fragmented and more than it's ever been. So we really have no idea, to be honest.
All right, very good. That's all to look forward to. The elections on Sunday, the 26th of September. And we will be back next week with looking at, what happened and some of the deeper changes that might be ongoing, because we will be welcoming back Wolfgang Strick. And that's an episode to look out for towards the end of next week. At the same time, we've got our generation series, OK Bunger, the problem of generations, coming out. The first episode is out this week. The next one, it will be out next week. So look out for that. And that's it from us for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah, but you were right. I mean, it's completely fucked. I mean, they put themselves in this position, and nobody knows why. If you could sum up the entirety of German politics and European politics, it's just self-inflicted wounds over the last 20 decades, like making yourself from the most prosperous part of the world to a much poorer part for no particular reason.
Well, I suppose, I assume they feel like they can't do nuclear. And thus they need the Russian gas to make up for it. So for the shortfalls and the unreliability of renewables. So, that's the way I read it. I just read it as kind of necessity, even if kind of self-imposed. But maybe there's more going on. Maybe I spoke to Emmett Penny, who runs a podcast and kind of follows all this energy politics, and he mentioned he wouldn't be surprised if Gazprom was covertly supporting Greenpeace in Germany, because obviously their interest is in ensuring that Germany doesn't go nuclear now. So,
they totally do that. I mean, climate change deniers in the US, like big corporates, have also covertly supported certain climate change, because they want to confuse the audience, and that they at the same time recognize climate change as sort of a problem, but then at the other time they undermine everything to, they support a carbon tax, for instance, publicly, because they know a carbon tax will never fly, and therefore they can undermine every other green political policy reform, because the carbon tax thing sort of sucks out the energy, the oxygen from everything else. It's quite clever, and I'm pretty sure they do that in Germany too.